אמונה שלמה, אני מאמין באמונה, אמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, אני מאמין באמונה, באמונה, אמונה שלמה, אני מאמין באמונה, באמונה, אמונה שלמה, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין, אני מאמין, בביאת המשיח, בביאת המשיח, אני מאמין, אני מאמין.
אני מאמין, אני מאמין. Oh, is that a beautiful song or what? I love that song. It's called Mashiach by Zusha, the group Zusha, based on one of the 13 principles of faith from Maimonides, Principle 12. I believe with a complete faith in the coming of Mashiach, and even though he may tarry in waiting, in spite of that, I will still wait expectantly for him each day that he could come today. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's a Wednesday. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this evening? We've got a very colorful page tonight. If you're watching for the first time, make sure you let us know in the comments so I can give you a shout out. Wakas Kurishi says, bro, welcome, bro. Stephen Gaguerre with us from Dover, New Hampshire. Yehudit from Florence. James from Indianapolis. Leona from Southern Illinois. Melissa from Great Neck, New York. Joy Lynn from New Jersey in the Pines. Sandy, good evening from Michigan. Nancy from Southern Pines, North Carolina. Alan Haney, shalom from Columbia, Maryland. Stephanie says, shalom aleichem. Francine from New York City. Chava from Chattanooga. Yosef from Lowell, Mass. He loves this song too. Sharon from Lebanon, New Jersey. Paula from Chicago. Sophia Sotelo from the Big Island. I assume that means Hawaii. Christina Vera from Texas. Hannah from Charlotte. Susan Sherwin from Scottsdale. Claudia from Sao Paulo, Brazil. So great to have you, Claudia. Charles Abraham from Texas. Robert is glad to be here. Jorge is with us from Rio. That's 2 in Brazil. Chava is a first-timer. Welcome, Chava Collins Hoffman. So glad you're here with us. Owen from New York City. And Michelle is with us from Indiana. And Jason is wishing us good health from Montreal, Canada in the house. And Schofler says shalom from New Jersey. And Celeste from Seattle. It's so good to be with you all. Today's learning, we have 2 dedications. One is Galia Baruch is dedicating today's learning in memory of our dear friend Ron Tzur El. May his memory always be for a blessing, a true man of kindness, constantly thinking of others, always the first to be there with actions or kind words of encouragement. May Ron Tsur El's memory always be for a blessing, and may our learning today dedicated to him inspire him and raise his neshama up, his soul up even a little higher in the world of souls. Also, Steve Morrow is dedicating our learning today in honor of Scott Flagle. And may he get a great merit for Scott on behalf of that dedication. All right. Okay. We're in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. We're on page 44. That's Daf Mem Daled. We're in chapter 4. We're going to complete our discussion of the first Mishnah in chapter 4, finally, and open our discussion of Mishnah number 2 in chapter 4. So we've been discussing what happens when a person is removed due to circumstances beyond their control from their Shabbos boundary, their Shabbos techum, the limits of how far they're allowed to walk, and somehow they got removed from that boundary, and how are they going to deal with that situation? So we have a lovely incident that's going to actually stretch out for almost our whole discussion today. That happened actually in the study hall. And I think it was probably the outdoors, right? So I believe what's going on, maybe it's outdoors, but it's definitely in the study hall on Shabbos, which they sometimes did outdoors and sometimes not. So this happened in the Jewish community in Bavel. I'm not sure which city. But what was happening was, we can actually really picture this, right? So the sages, it's like they were always in school, right? In the sense that they were the young students who are literally in school, but even the older scholars, the professionals who have other jobs and stuff, they're always learning. I mean, they get into that base midrash every day. They're always going to come to the study hall. And especially on Shabbos, they're going to even study some more. And so you can have very senior sages, sitting sort of, and the more senior they are, the more they'll sit toward the front row. So, and then the students will sit in the back, and then one of the senior sages will give a lecture, will teach and share, and then the other sages will question him, and even the students can ask questions as well. So get that picture in your head, sort of a semicircle of sages gathered around one of the Torah scholars giving a Torah lecture on a Saturday, and the students arranged even behind them. And probably students come and go. It's not like, you have to sit there. It's not like it's so strict that way. People can wander off. And so we have a situation where one of those students named Nechemya, the son of Rav Chanilai, who was a student of Rav Nachman, and I think Rav Nachman was the senior most, of the sages present in this event. And so this student, this youngster, Nechemya, was so engrossed in his learning. Maybe he just heard a fascinating lecture and he's trying to figure it out. He's trying to remember it, and he goes for a walk, or he's pacing, or however it happens. But because he's engrossed in his Torah study and walking, he walks beyond his Shabbos techum. Right? So he walks outside of his boundary. He went further. His boundary was 2,000 cubits from his Shabbos dwelling. And somehow he wandered out beyond that. And then he realized that he'd done that. So it happened to him, circumstances beyond his control. I mean, it's his own fault, but he did it unwittingly. Whatever the reason, now he's outside his Shabbos boundary. And as we learned in this Mishnah, the first Mishnah of chapter 4, so now he is limited to his 4 cubits, right? He's like in the center. It's I misspoke yesterday. I said he could walk 4 cubits in any direction. No. His circle is 4 cubits in diameter, so he can walk 2 cubits in any direction, which is like 2 steps. So he's really stuck where he is. He realizes it once he gets outside his boundaries, like, oh no, now I'm stuck. And he's basically going to have to wait there until Shabbos ends. Now, we also learned that there would be an exception for him. if he had to go to the bathroom, because the sages said great is human dignity, then he could go to the nearest bathroom and hopefully find his way back into his Shabbos boundary. And then he would reacquire his boundary and he would be free to roam, within that large area that is his Shabbos boundary. But let's say he doesn't have to go to the bathroom, so he can't make use of that, that loophole, as it were. It's not a loophole, but that exception. And so he's out there and he's stuck. Right? You can wander back in to go to the bathroom, but just because it's a hot day and you're out there in the sun, that's not going to be enough. So he's just sitting out there and he's resigned to himself. All right, I guess I'm going to have to wait here till Shabbos ends. And he just sits down out there on the ground. But back where the sages are studying, in the study hall, whether it's indoors or outdoors, probably in the shade, let's say it's outdoors, but in the shade, and Nechemya is out there stuck in the sun, right? So if we're going to picture this. So Rav Chisda, who's one of the senior sages there, but not the most senior, sees him out there and quickly grasps what's going on. So he turns to the senior sage, Rav Nachman, and Rav Chisda says to Rav Nachman, your student, Nechemya, is in distress. Clearly he's out there, he's wandered outside of his Shabbos boundary, and he can't get himself back in. So, Rav Nachman turns to Rav Chisda, and he says, okay, so make a human partition for him. What does this mean? There's enough people around that what they could do is make an enclosure that would sort of create a passage from where Nechemya is back to his boundary, right? And you could line up people on either side. They're going to have to be within 3 handbreadths of each other, because as we've learned, within 3 handbreadths, it's as if they're touching. And they're going to make a human wall, 2 walls, right? So that he can walk within that wall, within that passageway between those 2 walls of people. And that way he'd be in an enclosure. And once you're in an enclosure, so then you can wander all around the enclosure. It's as if you have only your 4 cubits, but if your 4 cubits is within an enclosure, as we learned the last 2 days, according to the holding of Rabban Gamliel, then you can walk throughout that enclosure and he could come back in. So that's what Rav Nachman is instructing Rav Chisda to arrange. Rav Chisda hesitates. He's not sure if this is permitted. In the front row of the assembled sages is Rava, very senior sage. I don't know if he's, I don't know how old he is when this incident happens. Has he reached his full seniority yet or not? But he's in the front row. So he's definitely well respected already. Behind him is another sage who's not in the front row, but still very respected. He's in the second row. And this is Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak, right? So Rav Nachman, the son of Yitzhak. So let me just get this in front of me. Okay. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak taps Rava on the shoulder and says, so what's Rav Chisda's dilemma? Right? So now the 2 of them are aware what's going on, right? They get it, that Nechemya is out there stuck in the sun, that Rav Nachman said build a wall, and that Rav Chisda is hesitating. So now they're discussing it. And Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak says to Rava, what's the dilemma? Why is this so difficult? Why is this difficult? So now the Gemara is sort of going to fill in the conversation between Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak and Rava. So what is the dilemma? Why is Rav Chisda hesitating? All right, so we're going to look at this a few different ways and sort of rule out each sort of analysis of the question. We're going to suggest it, that this must be what the dilemma is, and then dismiss it because no, that's not what the dilemma is. So the first try at what is the dilemma is assuming that there are enough people to create this partition that's going to allow to make an enclosure so that Nechemya can find his way back to his own Shabbos techum, his own Shabbos boundary. It must be that this dilemma, that the question is, for Rav Chisda, does the halacha, does the law accord with that ruling of Rabban Gamliel, who said that if you are removed from your Shabbos boundary and you find yourself within an enclosure, that you get the full, you can roam around that whole enclosure, as we saw in that incident when Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehoshua were on a ship, and they were on it when Shabbos started, and the ship was in port, and after Shabbos started, the ship left port, so it left their Shabbos dwelling, went way past 2,000 cubits, and then the question was, could they roam around the ship, or are they going to be stuck in their 4 cubits? Rabban Gamliel said we can roam around the ship, and because it's an enclosure, as we discussed yesterday. And Akiva and Yehoshua thought, no, we better be stringent and just stay in our 4 cubits. But eventually, they discussed it all day, and even they realized, no, you can wander around the ship as long as there's an enclosure, right, that there's gunwales that haven't been breached, walls around the ship. You can wander all around the ship, even if it's stationary, even if it's not moving, which was the reasoning of Rabbi Zera yesterday. Okay, so the question is, maybe Rav Chisda is asking himself, does the halacha accord with Rabban Gamliel if you've been removed, or if you walked out unwittingly? Is that the same as being removed? So do you get, if you're stuck in your 4 cubits and then a partition forms around you that wasn't there when Shabbos began, or that your dwelling wasn't in that partition when Shabbos began, do you get to roam around it? So that's one way of stating this dilemma that Rav Chisda must be having, as Rava and Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak are speculating what is Rav Chisda hesitating for to form this human wall around Nechemya. Or maybe it's a different dilemma that is making Rav Chisda hesitate. Maybe the issue is that there's enough people to form the partition, but not quite enough. It's like they have enough sages and students here in the study hall that if they make this partition all the way around Nechemya, and then it won't quite reach his Shabbos boundary. They're going to come up short by a couple of people on each side. So the question is, if they can bring this partition to within 2 cubits of his boundary, but not reach the boundary, is that good enough? And then the question turns on a Mishna in which Rabbi Eliezer said that when you reach the edge of your Shabbos boundary, right? So now you're stuck, you can't go any further, but you have 4 cubits wherever you are all the time. You even have 4 cubits once you've left your boundary. As we said, Nechemya has the 4 cubits around him. If you're at the edge of your boundary, you still have 4 cubits around you, and therefore you have 2 cubits in the direction past the boundary. So if they can make a human wall that encircles Nechemya and comes within 2 cubits of his Shabbos boundary, right? And all these other people obviously have a different Shabbos dwelling than Nechemya does. Their houses are closer to this border than Nechemya's. So they can go wandering out there in the area that's outside his boundary, but it's within theirs. But they can't quite reach his boundary. So the question is, if the human wall that they're building comes within 2 cubits of his boundary, is that good enough so that according to Rabbi Eliezer, he can re-enter? Or do we hold according to the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and you don't get those 2 cubits? The partition has to reach that wall, as it were. So that's 2 different versions of what is the dilemma that's making Rav Chisda hesitate. Is it he's wondering whether the halacha accords to the Rabban Gamliel, that you can roam around in a dwelling that wasn't there when Shabbos began? Or is his question, does the halacha accord with Rabbi Eliezer that once you're near the edge, as long as you're within 2 cubits, that's good enough and you can re-enter? So the Gemara says, well, Rav already told us that the halacha accords with Rabban Gamliel. So for sure, he can wander around that enclosure. So the only question can be that second version of the dilemma. They can't quite get him back to a Shabbos boundary, but if they can get him within 2 cubits, may he re-enter? Does the halacha accord with Rabbi Eliezer on this question? And then Rav Nachman says to Rava, no. That's not what the issue is at all. It's neither of those constitute the dilemma. We have a different problem. The problem is, can you make a human wall to encircle Nechemya so that he can walk around and come back to his boundary? Can we make this human wall, which is a form of construction, right, where the building materials are humans? And we know that we can't build on Shabbos. You can't build a structure on Shabbos. So this human wall, is it considered a structure and we're constructing it on Shabbos? And that would be actually a Torah violation because you can't build on Shabbos. So that's the question. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzhak says to Rava, we have a baraisa that says if the wall of a sukkah fell on Shabbos or on a festival, we may not position people, animals, utensils, or even a bed that we're going to stand up and hang a sheet over it to sort of replace the breach in the wall of the sukkah, right? Oh, a sukkah has to have 3 walls. In fact, the third wall, we don't need much of a wall, just a little bit of the wall. We don't have to have 4 walls, but you have to have at least 3 walls. So let's say it's a 3-walled sukkah, and one of those walls fell down, so now this sukkah is no longer fit. You can't fulfill the obligation to eat and drink and sleep in it during the festival of Sukkot, during the holiday of Sukkot. And of course, if it was Chol HaMoed, like the intermediate days of Sukkot, well, then you could build. You wouldn't have a problem. But during the first 2 days of Sukkot, or the last days, or during Shabbos in the middle of Sukkot, right? So you can't build. It's prohibited to build. And if one of those walls fell down, you might have thought, okay, well, I'll position a person or an animal or some utensil or a bed on its end, standing up with a sheet over it. And that way it'll stand there as the third wall, and now I can fulfill my obligation to eat or drink or sleep in the sukkah. But the baraisa says, no, we cannot do that. Rav Nachman, Rava turns to Rav Nachman and says, you're bringing an objection from a baraisa that we can't put a person or an animal or utensil there during Sukkot. I also have a baraisa, and the baraisa that I bring says one may position his fellow as a wall to render a sukkah fit so that you can eat or drink or sleep in the sukkah and fulfill your obligation. So we seemingly have 2 baraisas that say the exact opposite things. It's completely contradicting each other. For those who are new, what is a baraisa? A baraisa is a teaching from the earlier sages, the sages called Tanaim of the Mishnaic period. So these are teachings of the earlier sages. They're very powerful, very authoritative, but not quite authoritative enough to be included in the Mishna. And the Mishna was the oral law that was set down into writing in about the year 200 of the Common Era. So a baraisa is a little less authoritative than a Mishnah. When a baraisa contradicts a Mishnah, the Mishnah wins. But we often bring down baraisas to help us understand what is a Mishnah actually saying. Here we have a case where we have 2 baraisas and they directly contradict each other. The Gemara says, no. There is no contradiction. There are words missing here. And what we have to understand is that one baraisa accords with Rabbi Eliezer, and the other baraisa accords with the rabbis. In what it accords with them where? accords with them in another Mishnah that we've already learned. You may recall from Tractate Shabbos. In a situation where somebody in his house has shutters, a shutter for a window. So now you got to go back in the ancient world, and a window was really a hole in the wall. And if you want to shut the window, how are you going to do that? I mean, they didn't have roller shades. They didn't have, glass windows on hinges. How do you shut a window? You pick up a big piece of wood, a board that's a shutter, and place it in the window opening, and that's how you shut the window. Rabbi Eliezer said, if the shutter is attached to the wall in some way, like tied with a rope, and it's attached to the wall, even if it's resting on the floor, but it's attached to the wall, so then you can pick up the shutter and put it in the window and shut the window. But if it's not attached to the wall, then it's like you're adding to the structure, right? In a sense, it's like you're adding a temporary structure. They're calling it a tent for the purposes of argument. It's like you're adding a temporary tent or a temporary partition to a permanent structure. Eliezer says you cannot do that on Shabbos, and the rabbis who dispute Eliezer say you can. And the halacha, by the way, is with the rabbis. You can put that shutter in the window, even if it's not attached to the wall or the window with a rope or some other means. So it would seem here that these two baraisas, one which says you can use, let's talk about a person because that's what's relevant here. One says you can use a person to replace a wall of a sukkah that fell down, and the other says you cannot use a person to replace a wall of a sukkah that fell down. And it would seem that one of these baraisas accords with the rabbis that say you can put that shutter in the window, or here you can put that person in the opening of the sukkah, even though obviously the person's not attached to the sukkah. And the other baraisa is according to Rabbi Eliezer, and it says, no, since the person is not attached to the sukkah, you can't stick them in that opening, and that's why this is not permitted. You can't add a tent to a temporary tent to a permanent structure on Shabbos, according to Eliezer, and you can add a temporary tent to a permanent structure, according to the rabbis. However, all agree that you cannot erect a temporary tent by itself, right? You can attach like an awning to a house, so that maybe you could have some shade, or you can you can make a partition that's attached to a house on Shabbos. But you can't just make a freestanding partition or a freestanding tent on Shabbos. That's too much like building. The other is just adding to something that's already built, and it's somewhat inconsequential what you're adding because it's temporary. But the other, putting up a tent or creating a wall of people, well, that's building. You can't do that on Shabbos. So according to all these opinions, it would seem that you can't make a wall of humans on Shabbos. So, right? So therefore, no people wall to surround Nechemya and bring him back into his Shabbos boundary if building a people wall is considered putting up a tent. Right? And since we saw that in some cases where they argued about whether you can use a person to substitute for a wall of a sukkah that fell down, it would seem like putting a person in that hole would suggest that a person is considered, if you're making them stand somewhere to form part of a wall, like that might be considered building a temporary tent. You can add it to something existing like that sukkah, but you can't just make a wall out of people. It's not attached to anything else, seemingly. But the Gemara says, no. We're on the wrong track altogether. That's not what the issue is. That is not what the issue is. Really what's going on here is that we have a baraisa that says, according to Rabbi Meir, you can't put an animal to replace a wall of a sukkah that fell down. Why? Because the animal may wander off. It's too temporary. Right? You can't rely on the animal to stand there while you're eating and drinking, or let alone sleeping in the sukkah. But so therefore, a sukkah that relies on an animal to replace a wall that fell down is not fit. It is an unfit sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda disputes Rabbi Meir and says, no, the animal's good enough. He's not going to wander off so quickly while the animal is standing there. That is a fit sukkah. It is a valid sukkah. So if that's what the issue is, and maybe that's what Rav Chisda is thinking about when he's hesitating to arrange people to make an enclosure so that Nechemya can wander in out of the sun. So if we applied this analysis to our situation, Rabbi Meir, who said that you can't put an animal in the breach of a broken sukkah because the animal might wander off, here he would say, okay. Why? Because first of all, these people aren't going to wander off. Right? They're different from animals. But also because the question is, are we actually building a wall by arranging these people as a temporary partition? If so, this is construction and it's not permitted on Shabbos. But Rabbi Meir would say, no. A people partition, it's not an actual structure. Just like we don't rely on an animal to stand there when the sukkah wall falls down, we don't call that a wall built of living beings an actual structure. So it's not building, but it is a partition, so it would work, and we can build it around Nechemya and pull him in. But Rabbi Yehuda said you can use the animal to stand there in place of the wall. So it is a real structure. You're completing the sukkah so that it is now a full structure and you can eat and drink and sleep there. So therefore, arranging living beings as partitions on Shabbos is prohibited because it is an actual act of building. So therefore, we cannot bring Nechemya in out of the sun. Remember the pictures. Poor Nechemya, he's still out there in the sun. He's dying of heat. Rav Chisda is hesitating. What am I going to do? In the front row, Rava and the guy behind them, Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak, are trying to figure out what is the dilemma that's making Rav Chisda pause. And they're trying all these different disputes from other Baraises and Mishnas to see what exactly is Rav Chisda thinking about. But the Gemara says, no. People are not animals. We're not concerned that they'll wander off. So even Rabbi Meir could object that this is in fact a partition and it is in fact building. So even according to Rabbi Meir, this isn't going to work. Rather, if there's a chance that we're going to make this work, it's this. Putting people there as a wall on Shabbos is prohibited because it's an act of building. But if you arrange those people and they don't know that they're being arranged to stand as a fence, to be an enclosure so that somebody else can walk in, out of the sun and back into his partition. If they're just told to stand there and they don't know why they're standing there, then this will work. Why? Because it's an atypical, non-standard form of building, right? It's already pretty atypical that you're going to make a wall out of people to create an enclosure so that Nechemya can come in out of the sun. But once you're making it out of people, as we've seen, people can become walls of a sukkah that is valid, at least according to some opinions. So it is a form of building. But when you do that, right, and we say people aren't like animals because they're not going to wander away, so that's because they know that they're being used as a wall at that moment. But if they don't know, then it's an atypical form of building. And we've seen things like this before with articles that are muksa, that are not prepared for Shabbos use. And so we have a rule that we don't touch them on Shabbos. But sometimes you have to move it for its place, right? You're going to move this muksa, untouchable item on Shabbos. And when you have to move it because you need its place, like somebody left a hammer on the table where we're going to have lunch for Shabbos, of course we can't use that hammer as a tool on Shabbos. We could use it to crack nuts, but assuming that that's not the situation, we just want to get it off the table. So it's permitted to move it, but when we move it, we want to acknowledge that this item is it's something we use for work during the week. We don't really want to touch it on Shabbos. Now we're going to touch it on Shabbos because we want its place on the table. So when we pick up the hammer, instead of picking it up like this, we'll kind of pick it up with our left hand and with an odd grip and sort of like keep it away from us and move it out of the way. An atypical, non-standard way of handling the hammer. And likewise here, we're going to arrange the people as a wall, but we're going to do it in an atypical, non-standard way. So, it's going to be permitted to make that wall, but we have to do it with people who don't know that they are participating in creating a human wall that's going to be an enclosure, that's going to surround Rav Chisda, and is going to allow him to walk back into his Shabbos boundary. And that, in fact, is what happened. So, could Rav Nachman, who said to Rav Chisda, go out and build a partition, can he participate in the partition? Can he be part of the wall? No, he can't. Can Rav Chisda be part of the wall? No, he can't, because he's aware that that's why they're building the wall. Can Rava in the front row, or Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak in the second row, can they be part of this enclosure? No, they can't. So Rav Chisda's got to figure out a way to get a whole bunch of people arranged out there and standing in a line and making a partition, but somehow unknowingly that they can't realize that that's what they're doing. He has to arrange it, and they can do it because they're sages and these are their colleagues and students, and they're just going to do what they're told, and maybe they're going to practice willful ignorance, right? Or rather, suspend their disbelief, as it were, so to make this thing possible. And that's what they did. They arranged the people somehow unknowingly. They arranged the partition so that there was a passageway so Nechemya could come in out of the sun, and Nechemya's distress was handled. That's what happened in that incident. And if you follow all the logic along the way, then you've learned quite a bit about what partitions we can build and what we can't build, and whether you can wander around and how far you can go when you're outside your Shabbos boundary, where you entered unwittingly, and how your friends can conspire to help you get back. But they have to be very careful, not only about what they do and who's involved, but who knows what they're doing and when do they know it, right? All right. If you've got questions or comments about this, please put them in the comments now. I'm about to finish just a little bit more. And if you're with us for the first time, make sure you let us know, and then Nina will slip me the questions and comments. It doesn't have to be a question. If you just have a comment about what we're talking about, put it in there as well. Okay, that actually completes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 4 of Masechet Eruvin. Tractate Eruvin, and now we open our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Let me read you the Mishnah. We're only going to start our discussion today. The second Mishnah of chapter 4. With regard to one who was permitted to leave his Shabbos limit. In other words, he went out to testify that he had seen the new moon, or for some life-saving purpose, and they said to him along the way, the action has already been performed, and there is no need for you to travel for that purpose. He has 2,000 cubits in each direction from the location where he was standing when this was told to him. If he was within his original limit, it is considered as if he had not left his limit, and he may return to his original location. The sages formulated a principle. All who go out to battle and save lives may return to their original locations on Shabbos. So, in the first Mishnah, we were talking about somebody who, because they were forced by a wind or a storm or an evil spirit or by non-Jews or someone or something, forced them against their will out of their Shabbos boundary. Then they're going to be stuck where they are, but they'll have the 4 cubits around them. But if they happen to land in the middle of a city or in the middle of a boat or in the middle of an enclosed area, they're going to be able to wander around that enclosed area. In the second Mishnah, the person chooses to leave his Shabbos boundary, but he's not violating a law. because he's doing it not for his own purposes or his own pleasure, but on behalf of the community. He is performing a mitzvah, and that's why he's going to be allowed to leave his boundary. He's going to go out to save a life, or he's going to go out to see the moon, right? So seeing the moon and whether it's a new moon and whether a new month has begun, and then that person will come and testify in front of the Sanhedrin in ancient Israel when the new months were declared by the Sanhedrin, who would examine these witnesses who had seen the moon and then come in to testify about what they had seen. So that's on behalf of the community, so people can know whether the new month has begun or not. And presumably this is a category. It says also those who go out to battle. Right, so they're going to go fight a war to defend their countrymen, or maybe other mitzvahs as well will qualify. We're not sure yet, but this is what the Mishna says. And then what's interesting is, so they're allowed to go out, and if they're going to fulfill the purpose for that they're going out for, they can go out, and clearly they can come back. But the question is, if they start to go out, or they leave, and then somebody informs them, oh, don't worry, there were other witnesses who went to see the moon, you don't have to go. Or that person's life that you were going to save, don't worry, it's already been saved. Or whatever the mitzvah they were going to do, don't worry, it's already been taken care of. So the issue is what then? Right? So the Mishnah is telling us that if they've already left their boundary, then wherever they are, when they learn that their service is no longer permitted, that's like their new Shabbos dwelling. And from there, they get 2,000 cubits in any direction. So obviously, if the 2,000 cubits going back the way they had come is enough to get them back inside their boundary, they're all set. They can just come back to where they were and go on with their Shabbos as before. If they've gone so far that those 2,000 cubits from the new dwelling will not get them back into their boundary, then it seems like maybe, okay, they're going to have to just have the two. It's a pretty big area, right? 2/3 of a mile in either direction, so like 1.33 miles, a big circle with a diameter of 1.33 miles. They can wander around, but if that's way out in the countryside, it's not that great. They can wander around that big area, but maybe there's not a home or a place or a friend's house that they can enjoy their Shabbos in. They'd rather come back to where they started. The Gemara will also tell us that if they haven't left their boundary yet, then of course it's as before. But why is that even worth saying? And the thing is, well, they haven't left their boundary yet, but let's say they're near the boundary and then they find out, you were going to leave, you don't have to leave anymore. The thing has been taken care of. Does their dwelling now get shifted to where they're standing, which is near the edge of their own boundary? And now that's going to become the center of the circle. And the answer is no, their dwelling stays where it was. They just reacquire the same dwelling that they had before. And we'll continue our discussion of Mishnah number 2 tomorrow. Before I get to the comments and questions, what is our takeaway from today? Well, number 1, if a person is in distress, they're going to work hard within the law to get that person out of distress, right? This whole thing, like we slowed the discussion way down as we were speculating, and Rava and Rav Nachman bar Yitzhak were speculating what is Rav Chisda thinking about, but probably his hesitation was pretty quick, and if necessary, discussed it with Rav Nachman, the senior Rav Nachman, and then they worked it out and they got Nechemya out of the sun. Always, we're going to take care of people, and if somebody's in distress, we're going to find a way, if it's possible, to get them out of that distress. All right, let's check comments and questions. Jason Lipstein, but aren't those people creating the enclosure now themselves outside the normal boundary? Yes, but it's not their boundary, right? So for whatever reason, they live closer to the study hall where they're all sitting than Nechemya, who's stuck out there. It's his boundary that he's outside of it. None of this would work if those people had to leave their own boundary. But it's not that everybody has the same boundary, right? It depends on where your dwelling is. Now, you might say if they all live in a city and, and they all if all of them live in the same city, then yes, they all have the same dwelling and the boundary is going to be the same for all of them, 2,000 cubits beyond the city limit. But clearly in this situation, you had a bunch of people present who don't have the same boundary as Nechemya, and there's enough of them there so that they can make this enclosure. Okay, Yosef Shum says, was Rabban Gamliel of Hillel or Shammai? Tractate Shabbos says that the sages usually side with Hillel, right? Yes, I can't remember. I think maybe Rabban Gamliel is a descendant of Hillel. So probably he would accord with Hillel. I know that Rabbi Eliezer sides with Shammai. Shammai is usually a little bit more punctilious, a little bit more correct. Hillel a little bit more open-minded, shall we say. But remember, your ruling in one area comes out a little more lenient, but because you were lenient in one area, there'll be an implication in another area that comes out stringent. So I can't say with certainty, but my impression is that Rabban Gamliel follows Hillel. Jason Lipstein, what if a member, God forbid, suddenly dies on the spot? What happens to the wall? Please God, that shouldn't happen. But I guess if somebody died on the spot and he fell down, so there'd be an opening in the wall. But now, obviously, they have a much bigger problem. What are they going to do with that corpse? And it's on Shabbos, and we had a whole bunch of teachings about what to do with a corpse on Shabbos. One thing we do not want to do is let that corpse sit in the sun, because the dignity of a human corpse is tremendous. And they will find all kinds of legal, but sort of intricate ways to get that corpse out of the sun. Charles Abraham Ramirez Verdugo, what is the Gemara teaching us here? Perhaps it is teaching us the importance of redeeming a fellow Jew, especially if he is in distress. This is a true rescue mission to save Nechemya. May we merit to help those around us. Amen. 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 You couldn't have said it better. Well done. And Melissa says, can they pretend it's for a celebratory purpose, or would that be prohibited on Shabbos? Can they pretend, meaning that they're being arranged to form the partition? Like, remember, they can't pretend anything. They have to do it unknowingly. Like, they may restrain themselves from asking. Like, they're like, why are we doing this? And somebody else says, don't ask. Don't ask. We don't want to know, right? Rav Chisda didn't tell us why. He just told us to stand here. Clearly, we're not supposed to know, and they don't know. They're not going to go out of their way to find out. But they can't know and pretend it's for a different reason, because then it would be knowingly participating in the partition, and then it wouldn't work. And in fact, there were a couple of cases like that, right? So there were these members of a wedding party who engaged many people to bring water in on Shabbat from a public domain to a private domain through walls comprised of people who knew that they were being used as partitions for that purpose. And when Shmuel heard about this, he said they should be flogged. I don't know if they actually were flogged, but he's saying they did the wrong thing. They violated Shabbos. And he said, with regard to this matter, if the sages said that a partition is effective when the people act unknowingly, does this mean that they would also say that this is permitted ab initio from the beginning when they knowingly serve as a partition? Answer, no, it's not permitted when they do it knowingly. Pretending doesn't help in that situation. Okay, Nina had to go get one of our kids. So let me just check if there's any other questions that haven't been mentioned. Not over there, not over there. Okay. That's what I've got for us today. My pal, sending you a big hug. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Thursday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And we're mindful that Yom Kippur is coming. Yom Kippur is coming, starts Sunday night and Monday. Here in LA, it's going to be hot. We have a backyard minyan because we're not praying indoors yet. We're socially distanced and we're outdoors. It's going to be in the 90s. Thank God we're going to have a tent roof over our heads with open sides, so at least we'll have shade. But we are mindful that when we're fasting for 25 hours, it's going to be difficult to do that in an outdoor prayer space in the heat. So, I'm the gabbai of this minyan, and I'm working with the Rav to figure out, well, okay, How early can we call this minyan so that we're done with the morning prayers, which are very long on Yom Kippur, before the full heat of the day sets in, right? So it's a little bit of a similar issue that's coming up. But for all of us, as we participate in these days of awe, and every time we pray, we pray 3 times a day, and in every prayer, in the standing prayer, the 18 blessings, which we learn in the first tractate of the Talmud in Brachas, there are special additions during this time of year, several additions in the Amidah, where we say, we're mindful. This is a special period. And every day when we pray 3 times a day, we ask God to inscribe us in the book of life for another year of life, to inscribe us for blessings this year, for sweetness this year, for peace this year. And so I bless you all, my holy sisters and brothers, that you should have a year, this new year, 5781 on the Hebrew calendar. It should be a year of unlimited sweetness. You should all be inscribed for a year of unlimited sweetness. And we say, Amen.